Thank you very much. We're really grateful to be part of this program, and in particular because I think that this project can really benefit from law scholars that have been skeptical about common ownership, and as well because the aim of this project is global, and therefore I think that we can really benefit from your feedback about how your jurisdiction in particular is being reflected in the paper. So having said that, I'm going to start with a personal story. And the story is that in May 2024, the second largest bank in Spain, BBVA, with a 6 billion market cap, launched a hostile takeover on Sabadell, the fourth largest bank, with a 12 billion market cap. And that was an all-shares deal. And therefore, all shares deals have a lot of uncertainty. They depend on, what happens when you arrive at the final line with the relative market caps. The initial premium was 30%, but that premium evaporated really, really fast. And during the 16-month period until we arrived to the final tender period, even this premium became as low as minus 10%. So it took 16-month-long process to get all the approvals, the liquidity approval from the ECB, the competition approvals. It went through 3 stages precisely because of competition concerns within Europe. And we had a final governmental approval. And then when we finally got to the tender period, right, for us as board members, so the reason why is this personal is because I am sitting at Sabadell's board. So we were really concerned about, who is going to tender, right? So who are the shareholders? And we knew that at least one big shareholder was tendering, no matter the premium. And that shareholder was sitting at the board. He was a minority shareholder, fintech hedge fund. So we knew that 5% was already going in. So, of course, we were very interested not only in the distribution of our ownership, but as well in the structure. The distribution of the ownership was 50% retail and 50% institutional. And among those institutionals, we immediately recognized that there was a lot of overlap, not only with BBVA. So the overlap was between 18% at some points to 22%, 25%, depending on each month. But of course, this was a very long period. But as well, not only with BBVA, but with everyone else in the banking sector in Spain. And therefore, we were wondering, well, if the type of ownership is, it's important to understand the incentives, what are the incentives for these institutional owners to consolidate the banking industry in Spain? Okay, so let me give you another picture now, moving to Japan, right? So, this is what ownership looks like, and this is very much similar to the so-called airlines industry type of picture in Japan. So the usual suspects, the BlackRock, the Vanguards, but as well we can observe Daiwa Asset Management, Vanguard, Nomura as being very, very present across these technology companies. And let me show you another look at China. So China has a very different structure. We have here very large Chinese companies. The state ownership is extremely high. And then we have global institutional owners that together make, at most 3%. Okay, so we were, with this in mind, we were thinking, okay, can we build a picture? Can we get a sense of how does the common ownership, the tightness of the ownership look around the world? We know that in the US it has increased, but we know practically nothing outside the US. So the common ownership hypothesis, it started, with a very intra-industry perspective saying that, well, if large investors own share in many firms within the same industry, those investors may, and I'm stressing here, may have reduced incentives to compete very harsh to investments or allow for entry. They might have strong incentives or slightly stronger incentives to consolidate. At the same time, if we have now economy-wide common ownership, the the interest might shift from competition to a more governance and network implication. And here there are some recent papers that talk about the potential internalization of positive externalities, such as the work by Azar and Vives, the internalization of social and environmental externalities, and as well some governance implications with the work of Edmonds, saying that, well, if under common ownership, selling reveals low quality results, then there are increased incentives to monitor. Okay, so when we have economy-wide common ownership, the focus might shift to these network and governance effects. Now, what is the research objective? Well, answering if common ownership is an US-only phenomenon or something that is much more structural around the world and a feature of modern capital markets, and what are the institutional and legal characteristics that drive this rise. So what we document is, in fact, the prevalence and the drivers of this increase in common ownership around the world. And if we did the crazy exercise of thinking that the world was one big economy, and we take the top decile companies, it's a crazy experiment, right? Well, what we observe is that through time, common ownership has risen, and we are already observing here the impact of US companies in the top decile structure of ownership in the world. Right. Okay, so this gives an intuition that common ownership might be increasing even outside the US. If we look at this snapshot, we can already observe that common ownership is very heterogeneous across the world, with the US being extremely dark, an outlier, but China, South Africa being quite intense as well, Ireland, Northern Europe. Okay, so what are some of the main contributions of this project? So first of all, document the rise and the prevalence of common ownership across 49 countries. These countries cover 86% of global GDP. And what we observe is that common ownership is now a global phenomenon, that the United States is an outlier, and that firm size really, really matters. And it's going to matter not only in the US, but across jurisdictions. Once we focus on top tertile or even top decile companies, then common ownership becomes 3 times or 4 times larger. What drives this increase? What we've observed is that it's the expansion of institutional investment. And here we are going to see cases where there are relevant shocks, such as mergers across M&A, big M&A households, but as well ETF adoption across different jurisdictions. So it's about the growth of the network, the overlap, rather than the relative concentration. And here is where the big three really come into the story. From an institutional and legal environment, we've done a little bit of cross-country variation. This is mostly to see correlations, and what we observe is that investor protection correlates positively with common ownership, and competition law correlates negatively. Okay, so this is an empirical exercise, so it's very important to talk about the data that drives this. We focus on the Thomson Reuters global ownership. This is the main database. It covers institutional investors. What's interesting about this database vis-a-vis other large databases such as Capital IQ and FactSet is that they really record much better insiders, block holders, and family and government owners. In fact, here we see, that for ownership outside the US, family ownership is essential to be well recorded. And as well, we have done a series of additional data sourcing, and I would just like to highlight one of them, which is, we really went deep into the Chinese ownership and hand-collected data on the ownership side to identify the state-owned enterprises. Okay, measuring common ownership. So The classic measure are the kappas, as Edgeworth said, the coefficient of sympathy. So how much an investor S is going to care about what happens at another firm, firm G. And this coefficient has two important components, control and cash flows, okay? So if we are if the pair is within the same industry, we're going to have common ownership. If the pairs are across the industry, we're going to have universal ownership. And here we use the assumption of one share, one vote. All right, so some key cross-country patterns. As we said, the United States is a clear outlier, but other countries with high common ownership are Ireland, China, and South Africa. There's a bit of a strong north versus south, and there is high common ownership in many emerging markets in spite of having less mature asset management industries. In China, common ownership is obviously driven by the government being a universal owner, and in most cases, intra-industry common ownership is higher than inter, so beyond industry. And the only case that it's not like that is China. Okay, so here, the paper provides many different tables so that you can actually find your country and see what is going on. What you can see here on the average pairwise, these are the general kappas. So here we see, the US, Europe, and European countries, the decomposition. So you see the strength of the big three, okay, and the jump to the top tertile. And here we observe a jump in the US from 0.15 to 0.51, or for example, in, let's say here, Switzerland, for example, from 0.04 to 0.18. So the jump is substantial. Here we observe it as well for many Asian countries. So China, we're going to have 0.10 here, and doubling to 0.24 when we jump to the top tertile. Okay, so what about the evolution over time? So there is a global rise, but very uneven trajectories. And institutional shocks drive these abrupt jumps. I'm going to go directly to the graphs that are much more illustrative. So what we observe in the US is that this green line is the S&P 500, but you can see that even for above median size firms, you see above median, the increase in common ownership is really large. And that is precisely because of the presence of these very large institutions. In Europe, okay, for top tertile, we see here the jump in the BlackRock BGI acquisition. So firm size is a key driver of common ownership. Let me, in the benefit of time, jump to the graphs. So what we observe here, so the blue line is going to be for the top tertile firms, and we observe that overall across jurisdictions there is this increase. Yeah. So with respect to the role of the big three versus other institutions, big three is in green, okay, so very strong in the US. And in the euro area, the growth of the kappas comes from the big three, not from the other very large institutions. Okay. This picture looks different across other countries. So observe that in China, it's very flat, the big three, the green line. It's not the case in Australia, for example. Okay. So, we have a lot of heterogeneity across different jurisdictions. So the big three shape the global ownership patterns, but outside the US, for certain countries, that's not going to be the case. The next thing that we do is to decompose the kappas. And the kappas, when you assume one share, one vote, the variation of the kappas can be decomposed on the variation of the overlap or the variation of the concentration. So this is the benchmark from Bacchus, and in fact what we can observe here is that the relative HHI, so the relative concentration for example, the cross-section or the time series has some explainability, right? And in our case, when we do it for each, for all of these different countries, what we observe is that the overlap is what is really, really driving the change in the kappas, right? So it's mostly about breadth here and not concentration, okay? Final snapshot. What I want to show you now is the top 5 universal owners per country, and you can see that at the top, for example, for the US, Vanguard and BlackRock, they have a footprint. They are present in 40–45% of these companies with a stake higher than 5%. So not only they have breadth, but they have a lot of important stakes. But if you take here, for example, Germany, and you compare, for example, BlackRock versus Amundi, yeah, or DWS, as you can see here, is that the presence of BlackRock, they are present in 8% of the sample with very high stakes, versus Amundi or DSW or Norwest, they are present, but with much less stakes. Okay. I'm finishing. For China, what we observe here is that the government of China is present in 76% of the firms, and when we look at the distribution of the ownership, they hold more than 5% in 30% of the sample. So the Chinese government really has a massive footprint across the industry. So to conclude, what this project aims to do is to measure this common ownership as a global phenomenon, to see what are the main drivers, and what we conclude here is about breadth, and it's about institutional owners that are becoming big and present across the entire economy. Thank you very much.
So it's a great pleasure to be a discussant for Professor Giné, because she's one of the foremost leading scholars in common ownership around the world. In common ownership and now around the world. So before that, let me provide some remarks on the paper. So I think this paper really contributes to the literature because it's a landmark data set built with a lot of effort put into it, right? It's the first global map of common ownership, and there's detailed hand verification where vendors fail. There's a replicable baseline, and I'll tell you why this replicable baseline is important later, because anyone outside, including myself, can recompute the profit weights, and then we can verify the data, okay? They are also very disciplined about causation, so this means that, even though there's no identification strategy, they don't make these claims, which cannot be supported, and so I think the data which they have collected, at least if released, would be a public good for the whole field. Okay. Now, I guess I wasn't put here to just provide, praise for the paper. So I'm going to provide some comments and suggestions for the learned authors. Now, it's important to understand what's going on. So the authors are essentially providing, a weighted average of common ownership measures for each country, okay? So that's essentially what they're giving you in the previous tables. And in this particular graph, I'm trying to show you that the resolution of what matters is much more fine-grained than what the authors are presenting you, okay? So this is just the cosine overlapping ownership for S&P 500. You can see that each little dot refers to the cosine overlap between firm F and firm G, right? So let's say the overlapping ownership between Coca-Cola and Pepsi. Now, I discovered a mistake when I prepared this slide because it should have been two matrices, right? It should have been the profit weight of firm F on firm G as well as the profit weight of G on F. And they can be asymmetric, okay? This is really important. They can be asymmetric. So think about this from a policy perspective. It's quite problematic because in a merger review, the policymakers are only interested in a few cells, okay? They're not interested in the whole matrix or weighted average of the matrix, right? So there's lots of common ownership all over the place, but the dark lines are the ones where there's very little common ownership, Okay, and we'll see how the dark lines are going to matter a lot. Okay, so I have 4 comments or concerns. The first concern relates to data provenance. Okay, we're going to talk about coverage. The next one relates to omitted control structures, which relates to control. So we're going to talk a lot about dual class firms. And then we're going to talk about jurisdictional variation. And finally, we're going to discuss markups. Okay. So first one relates to coverage. Coverage is very important because the data is incomplete. Okay, so there are lots and lots of missing variables. Lots and lots of missing ownership variables where we don't know who the owner is. Now, the thing is the common ownership map a coverage map? This is very important because if common ownership is highly correlated with coverage, then what we're essentially measuring is coverage and not common ownership, right? So maybe the vendor discovered more, and reported more entities over time. So the graphs is essentially reflecting the increase in vendorship coverage and not common ownership. So we need to test this, okay? And so based on my preliminary test, it passes, okay? It passes. However, there are some surviving concerns in the sense that some of the countries have really low coverage. So a picture shows 1,000 words. You can see that this is kind of like a scatter plot. I'm not sure if we have laser pointer here, but anyway, you can see that this is, on the x-axis there's ownership coverage, and on the y-axis is the average kappa. Okay, so we see that the Spearman and Pearson correlation p-values are not statistically significant. Okay, one suggestion is to report this in the paper. Next, and the more interesting one, let's scrape the data. As some of you would know, with the rise of AI, anything on the internet can be scraped. If it's on the internet, I guarantee you it can be scraped, okay? And if you don't know how, you can ask me. But anything on the internet can be scraped, okay? So let's just make that clear. So, okay, what did I do? I don't have access to the data set that Professor Giné has. So what I did was that I just, okay, let's look at alternative, right? So I have FactSet data set, I have BVD, and then I have, more importantly, the Statutory Register of India. Now, why is this Statutory Register of India important? It's important because it's the official source of where the data comes from, right? The data vendor is not going to have a better source of data than the official statutory register, okay? And let's look at the distribution. Now, the key result is that the common ownership is going to have a 61% swing on the data source alone. Now, this is worrying because it suggests that what our results are going to be is going to be contingent on the data vendor or the way we scrape our data. Okay, so you can see that the BSC statutory register has the mean kappas are different, and the CDF is also very different. All right. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about ownership measurement and modeling. So measurement relates to where ownership and control visibly diverge, particularly where dual class firms are concerned. The authors exclude this from the data set, but I'm going to show that this is really important. Okay. So how do we show that this is really important? We're going to do something. What we're going to do is that we're going to create a data set whereby we split the voting rights from the economic rights. Okay, so we have voting wedge. And with a DEF14A parser, essentially we can create a scatter plot where you can see that with proportional ownership, with the 45 being in the 45-degree line, all of the data points are lying above that line. Okay. Now the real problem comes on on panel B, right? So what happens is that in this particular panel, you have a serious situation where Meta control follows votes instead of shares, and Mark Zuckerberg controls the votes of Meta and owns essentially nothing of Amazon. Meanwhile, Amazon's weight on Meta is untouched because Amazon's diversified owners still hold Meta. So with dual class firms, what happens is that a dual-class firm is commonly owned without being a common owner. What do I mean by this? What I mean by this is that this dual-class firm is controlled by, let's say, Mark, yeah? And then it's commonly owned by lots of diversified funds. However, it's not a common owner, okay, because it has control, right? So the profit weights are asymmetrical in this instance. So we have to be very careful because you see this large swing in profit weights. Okay, now I did some simulations, okay? I'm not going to go through the simulations in detail, but what I'm going to do is that I'm going to show you that with Benzev weights, okay, where we assume that the 51% holder is going to have 100% control, you're going to have very different outcomes for dual class owners, right? You can see that for dual class owners, depending on whether you use a voting sensitive weight as compared to proportional weights, you have like a complete swing in the common ownership weight, okay? So, you know, how reliable are the results if control is everything. This is a diagram showing that if we, you know, this is simulation, yeah? So if we assume that voting is correlated, the common ownership weights fall to 0 when the probability of probability of the institution follows a common proxy advisor signal increases. Okay, and the reason why this is so is because deviations from the block no longer matter. Okay, basically the winning block is almost always the controller. Okay, so let's look at the data itself. Does this matter? Well, if we look at the data, we see that China reaches a near identical kappa, even though we all know in this room that China and the United States have completely different economic systems, right? So in terms of the economic effects, downstream, like, are we really so sure that just because both of them have similar common ownership weights, that we're going to have similar effects? Okay, I think the authors should do this kind of robustness test, whereby, okay, we say that there's not much difference between control weight sensitivity versus register concentration. Yeah, my time is running out, but let me just go through a little bit of stuff. So in terms of legal origins, the authors claim that legal origins shape investor protection and in turn the concentration of common ownership. This is the causal chain. Legal origins induce investor protection, which induces changes in ownership concentration, which induces changes in kappa. So I took the author's own numbers. I ran it through data from the LLSV as well as Sparman. Okay, and essentially we don't see anything. So this means that it doesn't seem that this chain that you see here applies, right? Okay, for markups, the reason why I'm interested in markups is because this is really the policy variable that I'm interested in, right? Just because, let's think about it another way, the mere possibility that there's common ownership doesn't imply anything. What we're interested in is the real outcomes. You know, do markups increase because of antitrust concerns? Is CO2 reduced because there's internalization of global externalities? So I'm interested in these real outcomes. So let's do some robustness experiments with regard to markups. So the problem is, what did we just discuss? We said that it's not really robust to the inclusion of dual class firms. However, when we look at the markups of dual class firms, the dual class firm markups are at the tails. So we're essentially cutting off both sides of the distribution. Okay? And if we look at United States and China, we can see that, okay, they have very similar common ownership weights when aggregated to the country level. Again, very different markups, both in terms of levels as well as in growth. Okay, here I'm just going to give a shout out to Bolton and L, Puchniak and Dan and Umakan, who suggest that different owners have different objective functions. I think the rest of it is self-illustrate, right? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for wonderful discussion. Very insightful, and I think that you are looking, into the data in a fresh way. So that's really valuable for us because, after so much time devoting to the data in a pre-Gen AI time, we've been a little bit kind of stuck. So you are giving us ways into looking at it more critically. I'm glad that coverage is not driving our results, that we had and we will report that, and convinced us that dual class matters, so we're going to do that. In the US, dual class accounts for 6% of the firms, but we will do the exercise. In other jurisdictions, it's very important. In Sweden, it's at least 24%. In Mexico, it's very large. But in many other countries, it's relatively small. Like in Spain, it's less than 2%. Yes, so we're gonna do that, and we'll chat more about all the implications for markups. So thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation and very insightful. But I think it's not more like questions, but it's more like comments on your work, especially about Japan, because you use the asset managers as owners. But it's actually the GPIF, Government Pension Investment Fund, which is by far the largest ownership of Japan. The problem is that they cannot manage their own fund, so they have to delegate to more than 20 funds. And you probably count them as separate, but you can easily download all the holdings of GPIF from their website. They disclose all the holdings. That will probably improve the results. And my guess is that it will increase the proportion of common ownership because 90% of the GPIF's Japanese investment equity is passive. So by passive, it's automatically more like owning a lot of common companies. The second comment is that when I talked to the head of governance of GPIF, it's more like a consequential thing about this whole research. They said they never expected the companies to reduce the competition. That's their voting policy. They don't really object to their competition, and that's not their intention for this passive investment. So that's only the comment. Thank you.
Can I ask you about the
voting?
Let's
like 2 or 3 questions, then we'll come back. Jill?
So just a comment both with respect to your origin story and why the U.S. is distinctive. You might look at the history of retirement regulation in the United States, because during your time period, there are changes in ERISA. There's President Obama had a big initiative about reducing the cost of 401k plans, and a lot of that is what drove the industry's both concentration and size.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Kobe?
So it's fascinating. I think, when you try to find, you looked at investor protection and, the commentators say no influence. I think to me, it seems like the most natural reason for the growth of common ownership is that there is much more money flowing into these large institutional investors, and they look at what doing with this money. They cannot invest everything in the US, so they start, diversifying and invest elsewhere. And I think you'll find, like, if you look at the size and the growth, you'll see how it's explained the common ownership as well phenomena. Then there is, in the debate, especially in the US debate, there is a question about channel of influence. How exactly they influence. Now, channel of influence also depending on the type of law, and there actually investor protection can come into mind. So this is something to take into account. And there is also the positive and the negative story about common ownership. So I think that was in line of the last comment of the commentator, to see what you can find there. The negative or the positive influence in terms of outcomes.
So, you can respond to these 3 first. I have 2 more on the queue.
On the GPIF, rather than a comment, it's more, understanding the voting. I'd like to discuss with you the voting, if the GPIF are the ones exercising the votes, or they actually delegate to the asset managers. So that would be our rules. So if you have discretion over the votes, then that's the unit of investor. We aggregate up to that point. Jill, thank you very much for the suggestion on these changes in the retirement of regulation of retirement, and about the channel of influence. That's probably why I started with this story. That what I am, what I've lived through, and to my surprise, is that for consolidation, that was something that really mattered. That was not just the distribution, but it was really the structure that was important. And our minority shareholder that was sitting at the board, in fact, had positions in the rest of the industry. And when the hostile takeover took place, he retreated from those positions, of course, but he had a very distinct preference for that. And that was, to my surprise, part of the conversation. So, we had, together with Antón and Azar, we had published a paper in the JFE a few years before that about the effect of your positions in rivals being being an important kick into the value of acquired shareholders. So to me, it was really a surprise that that was part of the conversation. I think that, having experienced that and looking at some of the hedge funds, this is very much a strategy across hedge funds in some economies, that they enter the industry and they facilitate consolidation. I know a few examples in Mexico, in Argentina. So at least the influence in terms of consolidation is there. I would be much more careful in terms of, what happens with markups and so forth. However, companies do not like to compete very harshly, right? So it's I have a sense that there is a bit of a softening of this, the potential impetus to compete hardly, right? So it's kind of pulling up the foot from the accelerator of competition.
Yeah, so a super fascinating and I think a much needed paper. Maybe this is just more of a comment that Lin and I put together a paper on institutional investors in China a few years back, and came up with a similar result in the sense that BlackRock's, the big three don't have much of a stake, and then we go through the regulatory architecture that was used to build the institutional investor environment in China, right? But how it relates to, the classification of institutional investors in China is quite interesting, because of course you're always going to bifurcate between state-controlled institutional investors and private ones, but then we also look at the policy levers that the Chinese government has over the so-called private ones. And there's fairly good evidence that in times of financial crisis, people on the chat blogs will be saying, when is the national team going to be coming? Mm-hmm. And the national team does not only involve the so-called state institutional investors, but it also involves them flipping the switch and activating the levers they have, for instance, over renewal of asset managers' licenses, to be able to activate the so-called private ones. So you may want to look at this architecture to see exactly how you're separating out, right, what you're calling a so-called state institutional investor versus a private one, mm-hmm. and how that distinction actually matters at the end of the day for governance.
Thanks for this. Among other things, it shows in a way, the convergence of governance norms across the world, right? Because the standard of investability has been achieved at many places as reflected in the rise of common ownership. I think, for me, that's the most important thing that you show, which is this kind of convergence in a way that that investors of this type feel it's safe, basically, to make a long-term investment. So a couple other points. One of which I think it's really important to distinguish between the potentially, from a channel point of view, distinguish between the big three on the one hand and active investors on the other. Because in the story you told, the Spanish bank, well, that's not a big three type investor. That's, an active investor. A hedge fund would, of course, have goals of that sort if it sat on the boards of many different firms in a consolidating area, except and present a distinct set of concerns. But that's not the big three, because the argument would be they don't play roles of that. A, they don't sit on boards. That's really important. And B, they don't play roles of that sort. Second point, so they're now in the United States is sort of the occasion for natural experiments on the way, if at all, the big three would exert the influence over decisions. So, for example, the SEC just changed its rules about 13D and G, essentially saying that more aggressive questioning by a big three actor might be regarded as sufficient to switch it from a passive investor, a 13G, to a 13D. And so therefore, the big three have really pulled back in some respects on their engagement with firms. So does that show up? I realize it's recent, but is that going to show up in some of the behavioral stuff that you guys identify as showing, some sort of, semi-collusive or whatever behavior? And similarly, the whole move to in which the big three are trying to divest themselves of voting power and responsibility, whether it's through pass-through voting or other means, again, is an effort to disempower them. Mm-hmm. And if the question is whether that's going to show up in some of the outcome, the normative, the outcome measures that you regard as important elements in the common ownership story. And again, those things are external to anything the big three themselves are deciding to do. They're being posed externally. And so I think they would be a way of trying to get at some of the normative issues that Kenneth was pushing you to address.
So, Mireia, I'm not going to give you a chance to respond because we have 3 questions and 1.5 minutes.
Can I just say that I really agree about the convergence of governance rules? Absolutely. And I think that the literature shows that, as these American investors arrive to Europe and to other jurisdictions, governance rules really change and they adapt to the Anglo-Saxon and the US rules. Smaller boards, much more disclosure, more independent, CEO, chairman. So, yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Which
Quickly,
has been very
comments.
beneficial for...
Speed round.
Okay, Khoo here. 2 quick comments. One is on the data quality. A few years ago, I worked on a similar project looking at state ownership around the world, relying on Orbis, FactSet, etc. And we figured out even the data vendors, miscalculate ownership, especially when the ultimate owner is the government, is very hard to identify. And we end up manually correcting 1/3 of the data. So maybe over time with the AI, with other things, data quality improve. But I think that's a big caveat since I work on this project. I think Pedro Matos, my co-author, presented at GCGC some year. I became very cautious with looking at ownership. The second point is I agree with some of the comments earlier that there are so many nuances, between different types of ownership, and especially when you look at China, where the government ownership is held by the State Asset Council, whereas if you look at ownership by sovereign wealth funds, by the Norwegian funds, by Temasek here, they are, held by, with the market logic, which is very different from the Chinese model, where the interest is mostly for national security, for stability, etc. So I don't know whether I'm personally struggling with putting this together in one category to think about the role of common ownership.
Yes.
Emil?
Mireia, just a very broad question. So I guess this common ownership is very striking, but I wonder how you think about sort of sub-delegation and specific, institutional mandates. Because some of this stuff that you're seeing BlackRock own X amount across all these different companies, some of it is like some pension fund that has a customized mandate, right, which will not influence in the same way as the rest of BlackRock. And I wonder if you have a sense of the magnitude of that. My sense is it's not small.
Jennifer.
Mine's a follow-on comment from Jeff's. In the Australian context, I think it is very important to distinguish between the different channels of influence. Yes. In the Australian context, the local superannuation or pension funds wildly outnumber, the influence of the BlackRocks, etc. Very high levels across different ASX-listed companies. And there was a 2020 parliamentary review that was extremely concerned in Australia by what level of influence the super funds had. And I know you had Australian local increase in one of your graphs, but when you had your picture of the world, Australia was very low levels of common ownership. So that was puzzling to me, given the power of the local institutional investors.
I think that,
So Mireia, so I know you want to respond. You have a lot of response, I'm sure. But we are running out of time, so maybe we can do this during lunch. So please feel free to look for Mireia and give you more comments during lunch. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.